Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture on LGBTQ arts. I have decided to retape the intro to this lecture, but you'll see me kind of cut to the lectures that you've been seeing all the way through this quarter that were recorded about 2 years ago. And I'm doing that, and I've actually added a little bit at the end on Catherine Opie's work as well, because after reviewing these, I thought I could do a better job, and I felt the need to do a new introduction to this, as well as a little bit more at the end. In any case, one of the reasons that I wanted to do a new introduction is that I thought in the first time that I recorded this that I didn't do the best job kind of linking this to movements that we've seen already, so as to kind of set the stage for the works of art that I'll be analyzing and introducing some of you to in a few moments here. And what I mean by that is just, it strikes me that if you think back over some of the standard ways that identity politics and questions about the importance of representing, right, representing one's own sense of self or one's community in a different light than that has been imposed upon you by the hegemonic cultures around you, you see over and over again some pretty standard types of moves, some pretty standard trajectories. So when we were looking at, for instance, feminism, we saw in the first generation of feminist artists a need to develop a community and shared common experience and issues by really emphasizing the idea of some essential qualities to women, whether those be biologically essential or culturally essential. The idea was all women share these things in common. And again, we've talked already about some of the strengths and limitations of that, but it's very standard for a group to posit an idea of an essential component, almost a biological component, to their cultural identity in the first instance, when these movements are first coming to the fore, when they're first making their argument, so to speak. And then we saw kind of criticisms of this coming from at least two different angles. One from those second generation feminists who are interested in postmodern and post-structuralist theories like Jacques Lacan's idea of the decentered subject and so forth, because for them, positing an essential identity is something that locks you in your biological or culturally essential box, right? Women should be this is what they are, this is what they're good at, and if you don't find yourself conforming to that or you want something else, you've just kind of argued yourself, or feminists have argued you into this limited area, one side of the binary or the bipolar field, as we talked about earlier in the quarter. The other criticism, of course, to feminism came from people of color. Particularly in our class, we looked at black women who said, hey, your issues, while some of them I share as a woman, don't quite line up to my experience as a black woman or a woman of color. And, you can probably imagine extending this, and it would have its own particularities, to other people of color, whether these be indigenous people, whether these be Latinx, whatever it might be. Of course, they would all have their own particular issues, but again, they might look at white, primarily middle-class women saying, hey, these are the issues we all share, and say, well, up to a point, and then we have all of these other things in our own intersectional identities that we have to deal with as well. So then, in other words, you see this kind of essentializing, then you see this splintering of that essentializing because it doesn't quite fit all people within that group. And it reminds us, of course, that even though we're talking about these groups as groups, and the politics of identity being communal at some level, and we know why this is important, right? To establish a community, to exert some kind of pressure on the powers that be is important. It can't happen with just all of us working individually and independent of one another. And yet, on the other hand, it's worth pausing here to say that none of these groups are monolithic, by which I just simply mean to say that while black people face common prejudices, while women face common prejudices and biases, and while these things are institutional or systemic, as we say, they are not all the same, right? So, different women have different experiences of being a woman in our society. Different black women have different experiences. They won't all share the same ideas, obviously. That would be silly to think that they would. And that's the same thing when we're talking about LGBTQ arts. Within the communities themselves, there's plenty of kind of, elbowing around and arguing and criticizing and trying to work out, what is the best way to approach these issues. And again, I suppose I should just pause and say again, something really simple that we all know. Not all black people share the same issues. Not all women share the same issues. Not all people who are homosexual or bisexual or identify in non-cisgendered ways share the same values or the same ideas. It's not a monolithic subject. So if some of the things that you've seen in this class don't line up to your experience, or you're saying, hey, isn't there another way of thinking about this? Of course there is. Of course there is. This is just a kind of entree in some of the bigger artists and bigger issues that have come to the fore, which is one of the reasons why I associated this, and I'm always a little bit uncomfortable in this lecture, with a moment in time where the LGBTQ groups, particularly LGBT groups, came together in opposition to government inaction with respect to the AIDS HIV crisis at the end of the 80s into the 90s. This is a moment in time in which people who are quite different and had different values and different ways of thinking about their own identity and their own, how their, let's say, how to put this, how their sexual identity or sexual orientation informed their broader identity, came together as a group because, for many of them, this was quite a crisis. And the inaction that they saw in the world around them wasn't doing them any favors. This was killing people at an alarming rate, and this is one of those issues that brought together people that otherwise might say, hey, I don't have all that much in common with every other gay or lesbian, bi or transgender person out there, but this is an issue that we need to come together around. And it created a wealth of very powerful, oftentimes disturbing art that I thought was a good way to kind of get more specific when we're going into these groups of artists. Because the other option is to say, well, let's look historically at gay and lesbian artists through the ages or something like that in the 20th century. And what I always want to say there is that I think most of us know, if you look back at the historical record, that of course heterosexual people have kind of been the norm. But beneath that norm and everywhere to be found have always been people who are not heterosexual, people who do not conform to heterosexual desire. Some of probably your favorite artists over the years, it turns out, were likely homosexual. And what do we do with that information? Well, one of the things we can do with that information is to acknowledge that some of the people that we've admired for ages, and going back to the great Greeks, if you've ever seen Greek vases, particularly vases from the Symposium, you'd be hard-pressed to be able to rationalize that there haven't been gay artists through the ages. Or if you think of Michelangelo, we don't know if he was gay or not, but, in my estimation, it seems pretty likely. Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, you just keep going on and pointing out that some of the people we've deeply admired in history, even though they were not able to be out and open with their sexuality, were likely homosexual, and we should keep that in mind when we think about our own biases, and we should always be testing those biases. In the 20th century, the basic trajectory of LGBTQ artists basically follows the same pathway that I laid out before. Obviously, there's a difference when it comes to racial identity. I should have mentioned that. So I made it mention that, people of color, particularly black people or African American people, didn't go directly to essentializing their racial identity because of all the pejoratives associated with that kind of biological essentializing of race. However, if you think about the moves that many black artists made towards recuperating traditions that go all the way back to Africa, kente cloth and so forth, you know that there is that component of cultural essentializing that starts off in even artists dealing with race and trying to dismantle some of the stereotypes and pejoratives associated with race. That's the same thing, by the way, with indigenous groups. You can think in our Pacific Northwest, how many groups of artists, and I will come at this a different way when we get to these groups, just to give you a different angle on it. How many different indigenous groups, tribal groups in the Pacific Northwest and the Salish, Sea have returned to cultural traditions that were stamped out by white culture and made those part of their own cultural identity, right? So what is the essentializing component of LGBTQ that starts it out? Well, really, it's an argument that starts primarily in the late 1960s through the 70s in opposition to groups of people that were saying that to be LGBTQ would be perverse. They said, listen, this is who I am. I was born this way. It is a natural condition, right? This isn't something that I chose. This is something that I was born into, whatever that means, right? And really this, again, was to counter the idea that to be homosexual was to be unnatural. And so there's a kind of essentializing there based upon biology, right? And I'm sure you can make sense of this, regardless of what your sexual identity is or your sexual orientation is, that to be born homosexual, especially in various parts of the world and parts of the United States, and I know some of this has changed dramatically in the last 20 years, but it's certainly not completely fixed by any means, makes your life more difficult in a lot of ways, and you have to face prejudices all the time. And so, if you think about people who have to face those all the time, and I'm sure you know and I know, and maybe directly how difficult this is, to imagine that you would choose this for yourself is for many people difficult to accept. But again, it's not a monolithic subject. So some people who are LGBTQ will think of this very strongly as something that's a biological kind of component that they were born with, that there's no getting around it. And other people will think, it's less kind of determinative. There's probably an entire spectrum out there. In any case, that's where this starts. It hasn't shifted a ton. There are groups that are kind of at the cutting edge of queer theory that make arguments about, the freedom of sexuality, and certainly make the argument that sexuality is much more fluid than it's ever been thought of, which is something that I find really compelling. The idea that we're neither necessarily completely, heterosexual or homosexual, but we find ourselves orienting ourselves towards those two binaries again because of the binaries that are in society, and likely our sexual interests and desires are a bit more fluid than that they hover between these different categories. I don't say that. I know sometimes that makes people uncomfortable to think about, especially people who are gay and lesbian, to think about, conceiving of your sexual orientation as something that has some fluidity to it. But I'm just trying to point to theorists who are out there who have made that argument. So with that being said, let's get to the terminology. I think we all know lesbian and gay as terms. And then bisexual, obviously. transgender initially meant something a little bit different than it means these days. Transgender early on just meant, and it still means this as well, someone who might be born biologically a man or a woman, but identifies in a non-cis way with the other gender. They feel inside, their sense of themselves is as a man, even if they may have been born with a female anatomy. But transgender has also taken on another connotation, which is a non-binary connotation. It's not just about kind of cross-gender thinking anymore. It's oftentimes meant to designate, and a lot of people identify with this, people who don't think in binary terms, that they're neither man nor woman, and find those labels completely, misinformed and not fitting to them, and they want to be thought of as transcending gender itself. So that's worth knowing. Queer is a relatively new term. It started to be bantered around in the basically the late 80s, early 90s, and it's taken on the connotation to mean someone who conceives of their sense of self, and frankly, conceives of all of these categories of sexuality and gender and so forth, as only formed in relation to normative principles which they want to queer or deconstruct or dismantle. Or another way to put this is to identify as queer is to identify a kind of importance in pointing to normative principles by which those who are not normative are understood to be lacking in one way or another. And with the idea being, of course, in the long run, that if you could point out that these normative principles are all societal constructs anyway, and that what they do is they set up this kind of criteria against which other people are judged and found to not measure up. So, for instance, here is heterosexuality is the norm, and against that norm, anyone who is not heterosexual is lacking or is perverse or unnatural. That's a problem. And so queer culture tends to identify with the need to point to normative principles and dismantle them. And it most often refers to people who are also, again, LGBT, but not always. There are a few people in my world who identify as queer who are heterosexuals. In any case, that gets us started. And then, of course, you have some of the other ones: asexual, intersexual, polyamorous. My favorite is demisexual, which, as I understand it, is someone who is sexually attracted to someone that they're intellectually and emotionally attracted to, which seems to me to be the right way around, but that's just my opinion. In any case, that's a way to kind of enter into these questions. We're going to start then this lecture with Andy Warhol, who was a very prominent gay artist associated with pop art, who was out at a time when most artists who are gay were closeted. When I think it's very common through the 1950s and 60s for people to make the argument that no one needs to know what's going on in my bedroom but me. It's no one else's issue. I don't need to be vocal about my sexuality to change things. It's a kind of like Clinton's don't ask, don't tell policy, where the vast majority of people, even if they were very well known as gay men or women, were not particularly activist about their gay identity, and it didn't filter in their art as much. Andy Warhol was very provocatively, openly gay, one of the very first of these, at least very well-known artists to be gay. Then we'll look at the work of Robert Mapplethorpe, whose work has to do with primarily, well, not exclusively, but a huge part of it has to do with picturing homoerotic desire, particularly male homoerotic desire in his works. Then we'll look at Catherine Opie's art. And in the second half of these lectures, we'll go on to look at artists closely associated with activism with respect to the AIDS-HIV crisis. starting with Andy Warhol, most people know Andy Warhol, of course, as the man who made the Campbell soup cans and became a famous pop artist after leaving the field of advertising in the late 50s, early 1960s. And this is absolutely kind of the way that he made himself known in the art world. It was his public persona, per se, but, you know, unlike many of the other artists of the same time period who are very well known as being gay artists, his artwork had a component to it that overtly addressed, at least early on, homoeroticism, and then later on some types of sexual innuendo and playful gestures that were kind of encoded with homosexual identity, or types of visual plays that would have been understandable by the homosexual community in a way that perhaps heterosexual communities not immersed in this visual language would have recognized. He is a member, though, even though he was very kind of overtly in what they called at the time swish gay, you know, very campy, very kind of flamboyant, very effeminate at times. You know, these kind of monikers of swish gay culture. He didn't make it a big deal in his art until the mid-60s and beyond. And as I said before, it was almost always kind of coded languages that needed to be read. They were only legible to particular members of the gay community because the innuendo is so subtle. But in his own private life and in his own private works of art, which you're looking at here on the screen, one of his drawings of same-sex affection. These are works from the late 1950s all the way through the 1960s. He oftentimes overtly, reference same-sex affection, same-sex eroticism, same-sex passion, and so forth, both in his drawings as well as in his famous films, which we'll talk about in a moment, his screen tests, and so forth. Now, Andy Warhol is part of a moment in kind of the history of gay and lesbian identity politics that we call the closet. During all the way up through the 1960s, frankly, to be gay was something that was oftentimes a carefully guarded secret because of the various laws, actual laws, as well as social mores of the heterosexual community that were imposed upon people who did not share heterosexual desire. The closet then is a kind of tactic or strategy that was maybe best referenced when Bill Clinton put it into law in the armed forces, where we said, don't ask, don't tell, right? If you're gay, but you keep that a secret, or it's just something that takes place in your own private life, it's not made public, then you can't be prejudiced against, you can't be held accountable for your own sexuality. If you don't make it a big deal, no one else will bother making it a big deal either. So went the kind of very simplistic logic here. And, it worked for a lot of people. There are some very famous, very influential artists of the 1950s, 60s, 70s who really put it into practice in their own lives and didn't extend any kinds of gay erotic, at least overt imagery into their art. And so that's something that's worth kind of referencing right off the bat. All of this changes, as the civil rights movement gains momentum through the 1960s. So are more overt, more kind of visible political gestures by the gay and lesbian communities. And this all comes to a head famously in this historical kind of signpost in the so-called Stonewall riots of the late 1960s. 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York, which was a kind of gay dive bar which was frequented by all types of, gay and lesbians, people with non-normative, heteronormative sexualities, but also Wall Street types that were remaining closeted and wanted to go kind of have an exuberant experience of their own closeted gay sexuality. This was a place that many people frequented. But during the 1960s, as is very common in New York, there was a kind of cleanup in the late 60s of Manhattan, where a lot of these bars and frequent hangouts for the gay and lesbian community were oftentimes rousted and even closed. And when this occurred at the Stonewall Inn, instead of accepting it passively, the gay and lesbian community acted out and refused to leave the bar. Over the course of a couple of days, this riot ensued, if you can call it a riot, in which initially, a few police officers who had come to close down the bar and clean it up and so forth, under the auspices of correcting the moral kinds of perversions of this community, as they would have said it. These gay and lesbian frequenters of this bar, as well as many others, came out en masse. And in the end, over 400 police officers found themselves kind of barricaded within the Stonewall Inn, while over 2,000 protesters on the outside were arguing for gay visibility and gay rights. This is oftentimes taken as kind of this landmark moment in which being silent no longer would work, needing to be activists and political in your agenda, making people aware of this very large community of people who didn't share the same sexual mores or preferences of the mainstream culture in which they lived, became very important to stand up for one's rights. It's oftentimes taken as kind of the first moment of the gay liberation movement. And from that moment forward, gay activism gets more and more common, more and more frequent, leading right up to the moment that we're going to be dealing with. In Andy Warhol's early works, these are all private works. These aren't works that were shown to the public. He was apparently very well known for, in his numerous kind of venues, kind of semi-private public venues such as the Underground and his factory, inviting people to pose for him so that he could, as you see here, draw their penises. It was one of his favorite kind of entree lines, according to many of Andy Warhol's friends, that he would meet you and then very quickly ask if he could sketch your penis. So, but again, this was all private. What is oftentimes said about these works too is that kind of look at them carefully. We're not looking at objects that are of phallic power. These aren't about penetration or giant phalluses. They're kind of pretty, little delicate things. They're kind of boyish and decorated and very, I don't know what word to put on them, but they're not objects of phallic power in any way as you might see elsewhere. Even some of Andy Warhol's most famous works, the Seattle Art Museum, of course, owns one of these double Elvis pictures, have coded innuendo in them, as many gay and lesbian art historians and critics have pointed out. These things could pass as just, as you see here, the double Elvis, could just pass as screenshots of these famous, almost campy actors, playing these roles in these, frankly, kind of very lowbrow films that were primarily all about the beauty of the actor himself, or his, in this case with Elvis, his incredible sex appeal both to men and to women, it turns out. But beyond that, there are all these little innuendos. When the double Elvises were first shown, it's kind of an odd situation, but these are all silkscreen prints, and they were printed out on a huge roll of canvas. That roll was not cut up, nor were the images framed before they were sent to the Ferris Gallery in LA, which was a very cutting-edge gallery on the West Coast. The first gallery to show Marcel Duchamp's work, for instance. Instead, what Andy Warhol did was just tell the curator that he was sending a roll and he could cut them up any way he wanted, as long as they were exhibited densely, edge to edge, all the way around the room, so that you were surrounded by these images. Now, as many art historians have said, there's some innuendo here. Everything about this has all of these little indications of male power, male sex appeal, phallic objects right and left, from the gun to the holster to the knife, to his pose, to this kind of incredibly beautiful, sex appeal of the actor himself. Moreover, Andy Warhol has composed these images so that these devils, these duplications of Elvis, touch each other and embrace each other and seem to rub against each other. And being in the gallery surrounded by these images of all of these reiterations of this really phallic, very erotic Elvis were meant to, at least at a kind of implicit level, allow for the possibility of a homoerotic viewing dynamic for those who were so inclined to find those there. So here's Andy Warhol amidst these figures, for instance. So it's like an innuendo. It's not overt. It's not about, gay identity. It's about kind of the possibility of a homoerotic exchange that is subtly coded into these images if you're looking for that. And that's the same thing that happens, frankly, with a lot of his movie stars. There's other ways to think about these, and I'm just briefly touching upon Marilyn Monroe here, another silkscreen print of Marilyn Monroe, which he started these images very shortly after her suicide. As many people have pointed out, this is part of that kind of camp aesthetic. You will read about camp in the various ways that this is defined in your readings. But think of the kind of campiness, the kind of worn out, made up, kind of just overdone sex appeal of Marilyn Monroe that now is made to look even kind of more worn out with the offset printing, the fact that at this point everyone recognizes that she was kind of used up by the society that turned her into the sex appeal object. And then, of course, Marilyn Monroe very quickly in the 1960s became a favorite kind of persona of people, playing at drag. And so there's that kind of innuendo there, a kind of appeal of these figures that are used by society that have this kind of sex appeal, but no longer, have any kind of personality of their own that is then adopted in various kinds of strategies of masquerade within the gay and lesbian communities. All innuendo then. One of his most overt, and by overt I mean in terms of Andy Warhol's kind of hidden implicit messaging, one of the most overt images or projects to address homoeroticism in his work is the work that you see on the screen here, which is a work that was called The 13 Most Wanted Men. In 1963, there was a World's Fair in New York City, and what you're looking at is the exterior of the art pavilion that housed the art for this World's Fair, whose slogan was "Peace through Understanding." And a lot of contemporary artists in the United States were invited to create works of art to decorate the exterior of this, and these were the kind of the most popular artists of their day. So Andy Warhol was invited to contribute a work of art to this. His project was something that was, on the one hand, a kind of critique of American culture, which many of those works were, of course, on their overt level. What he decided to do to represent some American values was to show 13 of the most wanted men in New York at the time, criminals then, or suspected criminals, by taking their mugshots from police registers, which are private, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Taking these mugshots from the police registers that look like this, and these were turned out kind of on a monthly basis, and enlarging these through the screen printing process and putting these on the wall of the building itself. What he was getting at was, during the 1960s and certainly before this, America was very much, and we continue to be very much, interested in the idea of celebrity. And it doesn't matter what kind of celebrity or kind of infamy you get in America. So Andy Warhol suggested, even if you were a crook, as he put it, you could still be famous, and people were all aspiring towards this fame. So the worse you are, you might get on this list of 13 most wanted men. And this would then reflect American values in the
U.S., that we were fascinated by criminals. Think of all the movies that are about gangsters in America, especially during the 30s all the way through the 50s, and what that says about American values. So on the surface, it was that. Like, what represents America? Well, here's something you might not have thought of before, but our fascination with criminals' fascination with getting famous through their exploits and so forth is a common theme. Even more interestingly, of course, these registers of the 13 most wanted people in New York at the time, criminals apparently competed to get on that list by upping the ante every time they committed a crime to try to get on this register. Now, unlike what I remember, where you'd walk into the post office and see kind of the most wanted criminals or whatever, these were all private. And the innuendo, the kind of, homosexual or homoerotic innuendo that is implied in these works starts from that. The way that Andy Warhol and many other people in the gay community got these images were through having kind of moles in the police department, oftentimes closeted gay men, who would pass out these kind of glossy photos of the next, group of most wanted men among the gay community, because these bad boys apparently were very hot in that community. In this instance, then, 13 most wanted men takes on a different innuendo. 13 most wanted not for their crimes, but for their, let's say, erotic charge here in these works. It also referenced a famous work, a film by Andy Warhol called The 13 Most Beautiful Boys, which you can even kind of go look this up, which is a bunch of kind of close-ups and very subtly eroticized images of beautiful men that he was working on. You can even more easily see some of the outtakes or some of the little films that were put together into this larger film if you go look at his famous screen test series, where he focuses a camera on men and kind of watches them and looks at them very voyeuristically. So it has that innuendo as well. As Richard Meyer has pointed out in another article that I didn't show you, there's this other thing that's going on as well. Because these images of the 13 most wanted men start as police profile snapshots, right? These mug shots. You get a full frontal look of the man, but then you get a profile look. And as these things are set up next to each other, these men look out at you, but they also look at each other. So it's a kind of male gazing that includes you in the scene or pinpoints you in the scene as a kind of exchange of male gazes here that has this, again, subtle innuendo when it comes to homoeroticism. Again, I want to be clear here. It's not that you need to read it this way, or even that this is so evident to the public. It was not. But that gay communities oftentimes could see this little subtle coding and have a kind of, secret language being spoken to them in public that they could recognize, but perhaps the rest of us of the time who were not a part of these communities would not be aware of. So it was a circulation of homoeroticism in the public realm in a way that was not particularly overt and very much a part of this age of the closeted gay community of the time. The work didn't pass. Nelson Rockefeller, who was in charge of he was a governor of New York at the time and in charge of kind of overseeing the World's Fair, asked that this be taken down almost immediately upon hearing of it. And so Andy Warhol was forced to spray over these images with his kind of iconic silver aluminum paint, which was a reference to the silver screen as well as, frankly, gay swish culture, at least in his own way of viewing it. And so you see that here. One of the more overt artists to deal with homoerotic imagery was Robert Mapplethorpe, whose self-portrait you're looking at here. Robert Mapplethorpe, grew up, as he puts it, kind of on the streets, confused about his own sexuality, showed a lot of artistic talent early on and went to school at Pratt in New York for a while, in Brooklyn, and then came back to become an incredibly prominent photographer. His work has many different manifestations and many different subjects, but of course what he's best known for are his homoerotic images. We will return to Robert Mapplethorpe next week as well when we're talking about the NEA and censorship in the arts, because he was the focus of a lot of that censorship, of course. So let's work our way through some of these images by Robert Mapplethorpe, starting early on in his career. Before he became a kind of photographer, became known primarily as a photographer, Robert Mapplethorpe did a lot of collage work. And most of this, it has some homoerotic kind of innuendo to it. It's not incredibly overt, but in a couple of instances, it is very overt. Early on in his career, he wasn't very active in gay and lesbian politics at all. He tended to kind of hover beneath the scene of things up until this moment. What you're looking at here is a collage that was created for the cover of a gay broadside known as Gay Power from 1970. Broadside is just a kind of cheaply produced newspaper that dealt with issues in the gay and lesbian community at the time. The topics in this ranged from, imagery to classified ads to bars to the latest, articles produced for the gay community at this time. And he was asked to produce a cover for this. So what you see here, and I'll just ask you to think a little bit about this and look at it as I always do. Here I am interpreting all these works for you, but it's just as important for you to look very carefully and analyze yourself. What he's doing is something that's very common, or a common strategy, in which he shows you, on the one hand, a homoerotic image, the nude male figure here who is wearing only kind of rubber boots here, a little nod to fetishes and so forth. And so it has this kind of homoerotic energy to it. But on the other hand, he's also encoding this with the various ways that type of imagery is censored by the world around him. So the censorship in this, or let's start with the homoerotic part. A lot of this is about veiling, hiding, kind of revealing, all of those things that we know are a part of sex and desire the world around, from lingerie to whatever you might add to this, right? Stripteases and so forth. We see a male figure nude, but he's hidden a little bit behind these two screens that are off to the side of him that look like doors that you might part to enter into his space. He's hidden by the bullseye that is on his penis here, and he's hidden most notably by this big black band that goes across his eyes here. Now, on the one hand, these are all, signifiers of veiling, of kind of waiting to be revealed, kind of that anticipatory logic of desire in which to see things all at once isn't to kind of have the buildup. On the other hand, however, a lot of this veiling is about censorship. The big black band across the eyes here, on the one hand, makes the figure anonymous, and, that's a part of desire as well, especially at this moment within the gay community and kind of these anonymous hookups that could occur within this community. But it was also something that was used to preserve the anonymity in documentary photos, primarily used by the government to catch and to be used as evidence against people who were caught in public performing same-sex acts, which of course were illegal. In fact, full frontal male nudity was illegal in the United States until 1966, which explains the bullseye that is over the genital zone of this. Now, on the other hand, the censorship also, of course, in a way, even though it's about censorship, elicits desire as well. The gay community, people who desire this body would want to see what is beneath the bullseye, which of course is the target zone. It draws us right in there. What is behind that kind of yellow paint that looks a little bit, and many people have noted this, like the cellophane that was used to cover up erotic magazines so that you couldn't quite see the image beneath them, but it had this like packaging to it that was in its own way very sensual. You couldn't wait to rip the packaging off and so forth. So he's playing with these dual codes, and the dual codes, as Robert Mapplethorpe put it, were all a part of the desire process. The fact that this was censored, that it was illicit, that it was frankly illegal, was paradoxically part of the reason that it was so hot, that it was so kind of desire provoking. And he didn't go into deep psychoanalytic reflection on what the repercussions of that might be for the gay community. He just noted that that was something in play. Many of his images are just beautiful, straightforward photography. This is one image from the so-called Y series that are primarily these beautiful still lives of flowers, and don't have any kind of overt erotic imaging to them. And so I'll show you some of these images for which he's known kind of in the wider world that aren't necessarily erotic images. This is Paloma Picasso. He's famously depicted in his photography any number of portraits of movie stars. Richard Gere here, a favorite, by the way, of the gay community of the time. He's also famous for depicting female bodybuilders and female bodies. These, of course, were not controversial in any real way. Depicting the female nude in the history of painting is a well-known practice. It's just as well-known in photography. These aren't overtly kind of pornographic eroticism, or they don't cross that kind of invisible line that is always, let's say, influx. That famous statement that you don't know, there's no way to define pornography until you see it, kind of thing. So a moving target. But these were very well accepted, and they're just understood as a beautification of the female body. Right? Very, very common things. You can find things like this going all the way back to the early surrealists. Now, of course, they are or can be understood as erotic, but because they don't transgress any boundaries here, they're still conceived to be heteroerotic instead of homoerotic. They weren't controversial in any meaningful way when they were exhibited. In fact, more often than not, as you see here on the cover of one of the anthologies of Robert Mapplethorpe's work, these nude figures were oftentimes linked to the classical tradition in arts, which is a nice way of redeeming them from any questions about homoeroticism. If you link them back to that well-honored classical tradition of the beauty of the body and beauty per se, it deflects any questions about homoeroticism and illicit overt erotic imagery. Where he got into more trouble, or where things started to get more, he got a lot of criticism for images of the men. Again, these were oftentimes linked to the classical tradition, but there's something in knowing that Robert Mapplethorpe was a gay man. He was very, very well known as an overt gay man, and we'll see some images that will tell you why. Then immediately kind of over-determines our relation to these images. Over-determination simply means something like, you can't help but think, because this is a gay artist, that we're seeing this figure, this man, through the eyes of someone who sexually desires him. We align ourselves with that and then have to read these things as homoerotic. Now, again, that's a little bit of a simplification. We can take them any way we want. As many of my female students have pointed out, my hetero female students, they're pretty erotic no matter who you are. So that's, one kind of simplification of the logic of these images. But nonetheless, that's the way that they were understood at the time. And Robert Mapplethorpe absolutely insisted upon this. One of the things that he said about his images of the male nude, and there are many, many of these, is that he was basically supplementing the history of art by showing images, homoerotic images, and filling in a lacune or an empty space in the history of art, or maybe even overtly kind of outing images from the past that could be understood as homoerotic as well. Many of these things look like, classical works of art or classical sculptures. In other words, there hadn't been enough representation of homoerotic images of men, and he was filling in that space. He was correcting an error in the representation of desire in the history of the West. And he said this over and over and over again. So we see these beautiful, beautiful images of the male body as objects of desire. Many of these use classical forms of fetishization, right? The figures are turned away. They don't stare back at us. They allow our own voyeuristic gaze. They're like a substitution of the female form that we encountered in the first couple of weeks for the male form, with the premise being that men are looking at these figures too. And of course, they don't want to confront or confuse our own homoerotic projections onto them. Right? So figures turned away, figures that are just bodies, figures that don't confront us in one way or another, figures that look like classical sculptures. This image has been manipulated to look like one of those broken torsos that you might find from the classical period, thus evoking the whole tradition of homoeroticism into the deep past. Many, art historians of the last 20 to 30 years have pointed out that in Greek society, where the classical tradition really begins in the West, many Greeks were homosexual, practiced homosexuality as a matter of course, that some of our favorite icons in the history of classicism, such as Michelangelo or Leonardo, seem to have homoerotic imagery in many of their works of art. Coupling the bodies together, of course, makes even more over the instances of homoeroticism. These images, as many people pointed out, that beautifully juxtapose this kind of alabaster white body with the beautiful black body, also raise the question of mixed race interaction on a homoerotic level, which, of course, upset quite a few mainstream Americans. Then there are the works that are even more fetishizing. This one's called The Polyester Suit, that fetishizes the black male penis, that image of kind of the overt virility of the black body. And by the way, there are many, as you've seen already, Robert Mapplethorpe's works that really focus on the black male as an object of desire. And because Mapplethorpe was a white male, it's as if the black male is the object of desire in this inequitable power relationship with the white male. So here's one more of these. Now he looks back out at you in this case, but he looks pretty forlorn and kind of there for you, all set up in the fetishization of that body and the black male genitalia. Not only critics, but also artists took Robert Mapplethorpe to task over this. There is, and this is a work of Rotimi Fani-Kayode, who was a black male artist from Great Britain at the time, who wanted to point out that the fetishization of the black male body as an object of desire is very stereotypical and very prejudicial. And what he's done here is he's mimicking some of the works of Robert Mapplethorpe, but he's playing up the idea of this kind of tribal exotic other and the fetishization of that body so as to I presume, critique the way that Mapplethorpe, as well as others, were fetishizing the black masculine body, now in homoerotic terms rather than heteroerotic terms. So that fetishization has more or less overt levels of, overt qualities to it. Here is a work that is known as Mark Stevens' Mr. 10.5 Inch. So once again, the fetishization of male genitalia, now with a little bit of a link to gay leather culture in the chaps that he's wearing here. Which then leads us to the most kind of overt manifestation of gay erotica in Robert Mapplethorpe's work, a series of works on S&M culture known as the X series, which were originally shown. They were produced during the years of between about 1978, 1979, 80. And they were first shown as a grouping in a famous show at 80 Langston Street Gallery, which is right in the heart of the gay leather district of San Francisco, in a show that was actually fully funded, or at least I think it was mainly funded by a National Endowment for the Arts grant that had no content restrictions on it. In fact, it originally was slated to be shown at the Simon Lewinsky Gallery, but it was turned down due to some censorship issues and then moved to this other venue. That was going to be about the last time that the National Endowment for the Arts could fund these things, because very quickly, as we'll see next week, the political right jumped on this as a wedge issue and started, really attacking the representation of gay erotica in the arts, at least that funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. But we'll come back to that next week in more detail. So what these images are about is, again, picturing a component of gay sexual experience. It's not, of course, only located in gay sexual experience, but it is one component of it. And it's important to stop and note now, although this is a bit of a kind of generalization, that one key constituent component, particularly of male gay identity all the way through the 1960s and 70s and 80s, was the idea that because, and I don't know if it's so strongly linked as this, but it's something that I've heard a lot of people say, particularly of older generations, that it felt like because you were so prejudiced against in so many different ways, that one of the things that you could really claim as a component of your own identity and your own pleasure was a kind of exuberant sexuality, and unchecked by standard moral sexuality, right? That this could be a component of, in particular, male gay identity, but it also, of course, extends beyond gay and lesbian into other realms as well. In other words, what you did in private for your own pleasure with like-minded people was nobody else's business, and it was something that you could take as your own, because already society had deemed you to be perverse. So, why not adopt various, sexual games and play that would be, heightened kind of pleasurable experience for yourself, including S&M culture. So it is worth noting that along with that kind of idea that one component of gay identity was this kind of exuberant sexuality, and I bring that up now because we will see how that runs headlong into the problems of the AIDS, HIV epidemic, and particularly its political framing. Along with that, Robert Mapplethorpe participated in this culture. He wasn't just a voyeur. He wasn't some kind of documentarian. He actually was someone who participated in this culture as one component of his own sexual exuberance. So I'll show you a couple of these images, and then we will do some work analyzing one or two. Again, the presumed audience for this in the first instance was not the wider kind of public. It was shown in San Francisco in an area that was, part of the gay leather kind of community. So it was really targeting a gay male audience in particular, and showing these images of their culture in a way, just as he was doing with the male nude, supplementing a history of art by showing different forms of eroticism and erotic display and erotic fantasy. I mean, that's a key component of this. We'll see over and again that these are incredibly theatrical. They're not real in the sense of these people walk around like this every day, or this is the only part of their personality. That was something that was oftentimes, the take of mainstream culture, that these are sexual perverts and that this is all they do and all they think about and so forth. No, this is a form of desire and of play and of sexual exuberance, and it's one component of a much larger person and their identity. One of the most famous of these images from the X series is a work that's known as Brian Ridley and Lyle Heater, which you're looking at here. And I'm going to ask you to just pause the lecture here and look at this image and try to decode it. It, of course, on the one hand, is a very, very straightforward kind of couples photo, right? We've got, it's partaking of norms of the representation of husband and wife, for instance, going back through the ages, where usually the woman is seated on the chair with the man standing behind, although, there is a possibility of exchange there where the man is sitting on the chair and the woman is standing behind him in a domestic interior. But in this case, of course, now we have a same-sex couple dressed in, leather and S&M culture with chains and a riding crop and, just partaking of these visual idioms of gay S&M culture here, but within a very, very, let's say, swanky domestic interior. These are, nothing else about this picture except the figures in here speaks of S&M culture. So in a way, it's promoting the idea of the theatricality or the role-playing that ensues in any kind of sexual relationship, in this case aligned with S&M culture. We look at this too, and so look around the room, a nice, so-called Oriental chair, Oriental rug, a beautiful Chippendale chair, some kind of really strange antler table off in the distance, nice clock. It could be any kind of middle-class interior except for this. So this is one component that is on display here. The other thing, though, is that these figures look back out at us, and they look a bit, I would say, defiant, or certainly not ashamed of being shown in this way. They look proud, or at least, strong in their self-presentation in this mode. The other thing that's oftentimes pointed out about this work and its theatricality is that there's a certain kind of weird power relationship here. Try to figure out who's actually in charge in this relationship, and your first thought is going to be the big guy standing up who holds the chains and the crops and so forth. But of course, as the gay public would have read this, that kind of role-playing oftentimes has its many reversals, and the person who is let's say the bottom, or the person who is, compliant, can oftentimes be the one who is actually in charge. And all those innuendos would have been something that the codes by which the gay community would have read this work. Ronald Mapplethorpe's own self-portrait in the X series is this, which of course is something that for many people is hard to look at. You see what is going on here. He has placed a bull whip inside his rectum here. He's turned around and is facing us. He's wearing all the components of, S&M gay culture at the time. As many people have pointed out, this is his way of implicating himself in the very culture that he has just been supposedly documenting. He is not this kind of tourist or, incredible voyeur who comes in and just sees the scene. He is showing it from the inside out, so to speak. He is a part of this culture. As Richard Meyer once pointed out, even the bullwhip here that is very closely aligned with the idea of anal eroticism, right? It's, in a sense, it's kind of like Carolee Schneemann pulling something out of her vagina and asking you to say, why are you so disgusted by this? He's trying to say, listen, within the gay community, the erotics of, anal sex are something that are very much a part of our culture. There's nothing disgusting for us about this, and kind of get used to it. There's another component to this. Richard Meyer once pointed out that this looks a little bit like the type of, cord that is used when you're taking a self-portrait to trip the shutter on a camera. And so the self-portrait, him looking back at us and self-displaying in this role as the participant in S&M gay culture is a very important component of this work. And here it is as the poster that was used for the show censored at, as I said, 80 Langston Street in San Francisco when it was first shown.
So I want to turn now to the work of Catherine Opie, who a lot of people talk about almost in the same breath as Robert Mapplethorpe, because they share very kind of common interests and thematics in their work. They're both photographers. They both work with LGBTQ issues. They're both very interested in depicting or making visible the communities that they identify with, that they are a part of. They go at things a little bit differently. There's very little in the work of Catherine Opie that I'm aware of that is about same-sex female eroticism, for instance. But beyond that, there are a lot of commonalities. And I thought it would be a kind of good pivot point for the last part of this first part of the lecture on LGBTQ issues to include her and to talk about some of the things that she opens up in her art that you couldn't talk about with Robert Mapplethorpe. This is what you're looking at is a series of 13 photographs known collectively as the Being and Having series that she produced first in 1991, and unofficially she has been adding to this over the years since this first iteration of it. What you're looking at then are, and you'll see this, I'll give you some close-ups, are women who are actually dressed to look like men. And I say that because when you see these up close, you'll be able to tell, and it's on purpose, that the masculinization of these faces is very much an act or a masquerade, a term that I'll get to in a moment, or a kind of playing. The mustaches, for instance, are, you can see the glue, you can see the netting underneath them. Oftentimes they're not really pulling it off, and that's on purpose. And I'll come back to why that's the case in a moment here. All of these women they're all her friends. They're all part of her community. Catherine Opie, in the 1990s, before queer was a big term around, identified as a lesbian woman. She identifies as queer now, and even more particularly, I just read this not too long ago in an interview with a very famous art historian by the name of Jonathan Katz, who is a gay man who is incredibly bright and has written a ton on these subjects. In an interview for an exhibition that's now going on maybe 7 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that, called Hide and Seek, that was about the kind of persistence of the AIDS HIV crisis in the contemporary moment, along with LGBTQ works. I gave a lecture for this at the Tacoma Art Museum, which was the only museum in town, by the way, that was willing to show these works because they were somehow understood as too controversial, which didn't quite make sense to me that the Seattle Art Museum wouldn't do this. I mean, that in today's day and age, museums still run away from subjects that are, well, by my standards anyway, they're not particularly controversial. But in any case, when Jonathan Katz asked her how she identified, her quote was, "I'm a badass butch and definitely a dyke." Now, one of the reasons I want to use that language, which I won't use again, but it's her quote, is because this is something that she does a lot in her art, which is something that's a part of many of the groups that we've talked about, is that she reappropriates or reclaims, or sometimes we call this resignifies, language that was initially pejorative and uses it to takes away or tries to take away, or at least how to put this, take the thorns out or take the fire out of really hateful language in order to reclaim it as one's own, to embody that idea, to say, you can't say this to me and hurt me with it. I'm gonna use this word within my own community. But her point is even more specific than that in a sense. So you know what I'm talking about. You think of all the different ways that, for instance, in hip-hop culture, various words that were used as pejoratives, as hate language against blacks get reappropriated and reclaimed by those cultures. In any case, the other thing I wanted to say about this is that she identifies as at least in the 1990s, in interview after interview, as a butch lesbian, as something that at the time was understood as a kind of masculinization of lesbians, something that was seen as a kind of identity. And that's part of what's going on here. As a matter of fact, if I get you in close on these figures, they're all clearly partaking of the tradition of portraiture, aren't they? I mean, we've got these portraits, they're up close, they all have that kind of weird yellow background that never has been entirely explained to my satisfaction anyway, but it really makes them pop off of the out of the frame, so to speak. And you get this close up, they're looking right back at us. There's this kind of intimacy there that happens with portraits, and then down below it, these little name tags, so to speak, the plaques, say their names, but their names are their nicknames within this friend group. This is actually a self-portrait of Catherine Opie, who is known as Beau here, and she's playing the part of, or masculinizing herself so as to kind of play this role. Now, about a year before this series came out, there was a very famous text published by the brilliant author Judith Butler called Gender Trouble, in which she took on Jacques Lacan's ideas about subjectivity and pointed out that they're still quite binary. We didn't get into all the ins and outs of this. But in her argument, what Judith Butler wanted to say is that, we impose upon sex, meaning someone's biological sex, the idea of gender, and that gender is always a construct that is still a binary no matter how far you seek to displace it. And so you needed something else in there. You needed to free it up. You needed what is often called room for maneuver, or some kind of playfulness within this binary construct to liberate us from these binaries when it comes to gender. Now, for her part, Catherine Opie has expressed over and again that she didn't really read Judith Butler. She knew those ideas were out there. But the ideas are very similar, and it's not surprising that they come about at about the same time. Because a key idea for Judith Butler was that our sense of self, our identity, is really what she called a masquerade. We play parts. We play parts that are already coded in society, meaning, you've got in my role, the typical white male, and I get to inhabit that positionality and play that part. It's scripted for me. If I wear the right clothes, I act the proper way, I have the right language, I will come across as a learned professor, for instance. There are those kinds of roles we know in society all the time, and I've made mention before of how common it is for us to be around one group of friends and act one way, or be around family members and act another way, right? We kind of inhabit these roles, these masquerades. Now, in this, you think about what a portrait is meant to do. A portrait's meant to tell you something about the sitter, as if the way that someone looks is somehow indicative of their inner state. That's always been the idea behind portraiture. And we've been messing around with this a little bit, talking about how accurately things actually represent us or represent particular groups, and how you have to kind of manage these representations. Well, what she's doing here is she's playing a role. She's masculinizing herself. The mustache here is actually directly adopted from kind of 1980s gay male culture. Sometimes this is called the clone culture of the 1980s, where, it's a joke now in some ways, where gay men affected particular looks so as to be able to identify with one another and to be able to kind of code the fact that they were gay or were acting this part. That was then adopted by, in this case, lesbian culture, butch lesbian culture, but not because, and this is the key thing, not because, as Catherine Opie put it in her quote, that these women wanted to be men all the time. She actually said one time, they don't want to be men or pass as men all the time. They just want to borrow male fantasies and play with them. And this is part of her own culture. It's a freedom then. It's a liberation. It's a way of saying, and it's not really about your sexual orientation. It's more about how you frame that sexual orientation beyond the limits of what have been placed upon it. In this case, a woman identifying, if only for a part, of her life as masculine because it offers a certain liberatory freedom. Now, again, the term transgender wasn't really thrown around during this day, but in the way that I talked about transgender at the beginning of this lecture, where I said one way of thinking about this is kind of liberating from the idea of gender. I don't fit into this or that. I'm both and more than that is a big idea in transgender. And this is a nod to that, right? Women, biologically, women playing the role of men, not all the time, not transgender in the sense that they identify solely with a man, even if they have, the sex of a woman, but rather that it is kind of freedom, that it is a role, that it is something that can be put on, played with, put away, another role can take its place. So again, and by the way, I should have said this before, but when trying to describe this, she's very tongue-in-cheek, is Catherine Opie. She once said of Bo, what kind of guy is Bo? And she said, well, Bo is a serial killer from the Midwest who's a used aluminum siding salesman. In other words, I'm not really going to give you any, here's who he really is, or here's who I am in this role. I'm going to be playful about it. Here's another one. Again, these are her friends. This is her community. She's giving visibility to this, to these people, both as a portrait, but also to the idea of some kind of transgressing and transcending of gender roles. This is Papa Bear, and in this case, it's a good one for seeing how fictitious these beards and facial hair are. You can see the netting here right below the lip ring, for instance, and the masculinization with the large piercings and the, more masculine sunglasses, I suppose. So this got a lot of attention from mainstream press, I think partially because, again, this was the age, and we'll be talking about this in a moment, in which it's not always this way, but the conservative arm of Congress really went after the National Endowment for the Arts, as we talked about, and we'll talk about next week too. And in doing so, a lot of visibility was given to LGBTQ artists, and Catherine Opie was certainly one of these to get a lot of visibility through this. She continues to get visibility. I thought this was apropos of today's age. This is a mask produced by one of the museums for the COVID-19 coronavirus that has that Catherine Opie self-portrait with a mustache. So I'm pretty sure you can get this online these days. Some of her other photography, again, is, I think, really piercing. It's really beautiful, by the way. The technique that's used in the photography itself, high def, beautiful printing, oftentimes really luxurious, saturated colors next to primarily women, and yet there's a part of it that just like pierces you. So here is one, the back of one of her friends, and on the back of her neck is tattooed the word dyke. This is, again, one of those attempts at reclamation or reappropriation of a word that has been used as hate language by the culture that it was used against, to both diffuse that power of that word over one, and also to take some of that power for yourself. It has this piercing quality, though, too, because it's a label that is forced on people, again, or actually inscribed is the word that we use when we talk about this in semiotic language, in order to hurt and demean and lessen these people. And here it is, something that has kind of both of those qualities. You see it on the back of the neck. You don't see her face. You just see this kind of anonymous figure in some ways that has been labeled something that is taboo. It's not even supposed to be spoken, of course, by anyone outside of this group. You certainly don't want to be slinging this word around or calling someone this word unless you're within the group and there's some kind of trust there. But against that kind of the ugliness of this word in some ways, you have this kind of beautiful body and this saturated, beautiful color behind it. And that's something that happens in a lot of her works. The backgrounds, these beautiful textured blankets that are behind the figures, is something that has this kind of, again, this very beautiful aesthetic against the grain of something that is quite piercing. This is her famous self-portrait, Pervert. So this is Catherine Opie, and if you're looking at the word that's on her chest there, that's actually a body scarification. It's an actual, it's cut in there with a needle that will then heal, but the word will be there as a scar. She created this work, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about her following Robert Mapplethorpe, and before we went into the AIDS, HIV, or even NEA controversies next week, she created this work in response to the way that she was feeling that what she calls now queer culture, but it's really at the time more understood as kind of lesbian culture, was really othering, as she said, leather gay and lesbian culture. So we saw this with Robert Mapplethorpe to some degree, and I said he wanted to embrace these things that were a part of his own gay desire. And Catherine Opie identifies with butch, lesbian, leather culture, S&M things, leather culture, just its own little kind of sub category of LGBTQ artists and people. And she was feeling that queer culture was saying these people are not us, they're not even a part of what we do, they don't have any values, they're the odd ones, they're the perverts. And that seemed to her to be even more hurtful in a way than being labeled a pervert by, let's say, a conservative. So she created this work. She's wearing the leather mask, she's got the piercings up and down her arm, and she's scarified her chest with this word. It's painful to look at. It's really understandable what she's up to, and to me it's quite a powerful statement. This is the final work. One of the final works that I wanted to show you today is this work, which is Catherine Opie's Back Now. This is, to me, one of those works that's so poignant. It's, again, a scarification of her back. I don't want to do too much interpreting of this for you. I'm sure you can come up with your own ideas here. But this is the type of a picture that probably is familiar to some of you. It'll certainly become familiar to many of you if you go on to have children in life, where your kids will bring you home a picture of your house and, mom and dad, and usually they're in there too. And they're pretty conventional and they look much the same, right? This one, though, of course, the two figures, mom and dad, so to speak, are mom and mom, or two people wearing skirts anyway. We don't really know. I think she's trying to be a bit ambivalent about that anyway. But if you think about this as, let's say, a work that was done in 1994, where it's still difficult, of course, in that day, and it's gotten somewhat easier, but it's not entirely easier for same-sex couples to adopt children, to be mother and mother, and all of the things that brings up, all of the things how that runs so counter to our normative principles, right? What does it mean to have two moms or two dads, or, some kind of blended family that doesn't match up to the norm of the nuclear family that, is the supposed American dream? And how does it pierce you, or maybe how is that in so many different ways difficult for you, for the child, for anything, to have to work against people's, normative principles? And I think there's something about this work that for me really gets there pretty quickly. Like, this is the actual, this isn't a scarified back that happened a year ago or has healed. It's just happened, and she is showing you that kind of pain along with, again, what I think of as kind of beauty. Because it seems to me that it doesn't take much to start to think beyond, how do I want to put this? it seems to me that you can imagine a place that we would get as a society in which this wasn't abnormal, that this wasn't unusual, that people weren't somehow defensive about the idea of a family being something other than that father, mother, nuclear family. Well, that's it for the first part of this lecture. In the next part of the lecture, we focus narrowly on artists' response to the AIDS-HIV crisis.